This story is titled, My GF Said I Was Easily Replaceable and That She Was Settling. But when I finally moved on, she realized she had made the biggest mistake of her life and begged me to take her back. Looking back, I should have noticed the signs sooner. They weren't dramatic, not at first. There were no screaming matches, no slammed doors, no outright betrayals. Just small things, easy to brush off in the moment, but impossible to ignore when they started piling up. A missed goodnight kiss. A distracted nod when I told her about my day. The way her eyes barely lifted from her phone when I walked through the door after an exhausting shift. But love has a way of making you blind to the things you don't want to see. And I loved Brittany. God, I loved her. She had this way about her, this magnetic presence that made people lean in, drawn to the effortless confidence she carried in every step. She wasn't just beautiful, she knew she was beautiful, and she wore that knowledge like armor. She was the kind of woman who could make a whole room pivot just by laughing at the right moment. And somehow she chose me. I used to tell myself that meant something, that it meant everything. We had been together for 2 years when she moved into my house. It wasn't a big place, just a modest 2-bedroom with a backyard I never quite got around to fixing up. But it was ours. Or at least I thought it was. At first it felt perfect, like we were building something real, something solid. She was finishing her degree and working part-time, and I didn't mind covering the bills. Rent, utilities, groceries, even her car insurance. It never bothered me. Relationships weren't about keeping score, at least not to me. I saw it as an investment, a way to make life easier for both of us while she worked toward her future. For a while, I thought she appreciated it. The first 6 months of living together were exactly how I imagined they would be. Late-night takeout on the couch, lazy Sunday mornings tangled up in bed, grocery runs that somehow turned into inside jokes. She made even the most mundane parts of life feel exciting. And then slowly, almost imperceptibly, something changed. At first, it was little things. She started eating dinner without me, leaving a plate wrapped in plastic on the counter instead of waiting like she used to. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe she was just hungrier than usual. Maybe I was reading too much into it. But then she started going out more. Not just with friends, but alone. Errands that stretched into hours. Weekend plans that didn't include me. She never hid anything outright, but she never offered details either. When I'd ask where she was heading, she'd shrug, say something vague like, "Just out," and slip through the door before I could press further. I wanted to believe it was just stress, that school was wearing her down and she needed space. But deep down, something in my gut told me the truth. Brittany was slipping away from me, piece by piece, and I had no idea how to stop it. I tried bringing it up once, gently, carefully, because the last thing I wanted was to come off as the insecure, needy boyfriend. I told her I missed the way things used to be, how we barely spent time together anymore. She gave me a quick, dismissive smile and told me I was overthinking things, that she just needed me time. As if that explained everything. As if that single phrase could justify how she had started treating our relationship like a convenience instead of a commitment. I let it go. What else was I supposed to do? But then, the distance between us widened. Some nights, I'd come home from a 12-hour shift to find the house dark, her side of the bed untouched. I'd shoot her a text, asking where she was, and she'd reply hours later with a simple, "Don't wait up." No details. No reassurance. Just those 3 words that felt more like a wall than an answer. I remember one night in particular. It had been a brutal day at work, the kind that left me drained down to my bones. I walked through the door, expecting, hoping, to see her waiting for me, maybe curled up on the couch like she used to be, flipping through one of her magazines. Instead, silence greeted me. I checked my phone. No messages. I sat down, staring at the empty space beside me, and for the first time I let myself admit it. This wasn't just a rough patch. This wasn't school stress or bad timing or anything I could fix by simply trying harder. Brittany was pulling away from me. And the worst part? She didn't even seem to care. It wasn't about the money. I would have kept paying for everything if it meant feeling like she actually wanted to be here. But I was starting to realize I was giving everything to someone who couldn't even be bothered to meet me halfway. I wasn't her partner anymore. I was just a placeholder. Someone to keep the lights on and the fridge full while she lived a life I was no longer a part of. And the more I tried to hold on to her, the more I felt her slipping through my fingers. But I wasn't ready to give up just yet. Not yet. I kept telling myself that things would get better, that this was just a phase, a momentary rough patch that every couple went through at some point. I wanted to believe that if I was patient enough, understanding enough, things would settle back into place, that Brittany would turn to me one night with that warm, teasing smile and tell me I had been worrying over nothing. But deep down, I knew the truth, and no amount of self-deception could erase the way she had started treating me. as if I were nothing more than background noise in the life she was living without me. The shift had been slow, creeping in like a shadow, stretching longer with each passing day. But by now, it was impossible to ignore. The late nights turned into entire weekends where she was nowhere to be found, her texts growing shorter, more impersonal, until even those became rare. When she was home, it felt like she wasn't really there, sitting beside me, but locked inside a world I no longer had access to, scrolling endlessly on her phone or staring absently at the television, offering little more than the occasional hum whenever I spoke. I tried convincing myself that I was imagining it, that I was just being paranoid, but then came the moment I could no longer deny what had been in front of me all along. It was a Friday evening, and I had left work earlier than usual, exhausted but eager to surprise her with takeout from her favorite restaurant, hoping, praying, that maybe, just maybe, we could have a quiet night together, a chance to reconnect, to remind ourselves why we had built this life in the first place. But when I pulled into the driveway, something felt off. Her car was parked where it always was, but there was another vehicle there too, one I didn't recognize. At first, I told myself it could be anything. Maybe a friend had stopped by, maybe her cousin was visiting. Some rational explanation that didn't immediately set my heart hammering against my ribs. But as I stepped inside, the sounds that met me instantly shattered any illusions I'd been desperately clinging to. Laughter, not just hers, but his. A voice I had never heard before, deep and confident, mingling with hers in a way that sent a slow, searing burn through my chest. I stood there, frozen in the doorway, listening as my girlfriend, my Brittany, laughed in a way I hadn't heard in months, carefree and full of warmth. A version of herself that had become nothing more than a memory whenever she was around me. And then there was the way she spoke to him. Light, teasing, laced with an intimacy that cut deeper than any knife. I stepped forward, my body moving before my mind could catch up. And when I turned the corner into the living room, I saw them. Brittany curled up on the couch, sitting far too close to a man I had never met, her legs tucked beneath her, head tilted slightly as she listened to him speak, completely engrossed in whatever story he was telling. The way she looked at him, leaning in, eyes bright, lips slightly parted in a small, amused smile. It was the kind of expression I hadn't seen directed at me in longer than I cared to admit. And then she saw me. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across her face. Shock, guilt, something unreadable. But it was gone almost instantly, replaced with that same casual, detached expression she had perfected over the past few months. She straightened slightly, but made no move to create distance between them, as if daring me to say something, to acknowledge the shift that had been happening right under my nose. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to demand an explanation, to force her to look me in the eye and tell me what the hell was going on. But more than anything, I just felt tired. Tired of being the only one who cared enough to fight for something that had clearly already been lost. So instead, I exhaled slowly, nodded toward the food in my hand, and set it down on the kitchen counter, the weight of unspoken words pressing against my chest like a stone. I didn't ask who he was. I didn't ask why he was there, because the truth was, I already knew. That night, she barely spoke to me. She disappeared into the bedroom before I could even bring myself to say a single word. And when I finally forced myself to go to bed hours later, I found her curled away from me, her back to mine, breathing slow and steady, as if she had already made peace with something I was only just beginning to grasp. I didn't sleep that night. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every moment of our relationship, searching for the exact point where things had gone wrong. But the answer didn't come, because the truth was, it hadn't happened in a single moment. It had been a gradual unraveling, a slow erosion of something I had once believed was unbreakable. And now there was no putting it back together. I knew what had to be done. I just wasn't ready to do it yet. There is a particular kind of loneliness that settles into your bones when you realize you're sharing a life with someone who has already left you in every way that matters. It's not the sharp, immediate kind of pain that knocks the air from your lungs. It's slower, more insidious, a dull ache that creeps into every quiet moment, making itself at home in the spaces where love used to live. I had been feeling it for months, maybe longer, but that night, after watching Brittany lean into a man I had never met, after seeing her light up in a way she no longer did with me, it became unbearable. I wanted to tell myself I was imagining things, that I was reading too much into a situation that, on the surface, could have been harmless. Maybe he was just a friend. Maybe she really had been pulling away because of stress, because of school, because of anything other than the possibility that she simply didn't want me anymore. But deep down, I knew better. I knew it in the way she didn't flinch when she saw me standing there, in the way she didn't bother to move away from him, didn't make even the smallest effort to reassure me that nothing was going on. It wasn't just that she had emotionally checked out, it was that she didn't care if I noticed. That realization sat with me for days, growing heavier with each passing moment. I found myself replaying every conversation, every time she had brushed me off or told me I was overthinking things. I thought about the nights I had spent waiting for her to come home, the texts left unanswered, the way my presence in our own home seemed more like an afterthought than a comfort. I'd been making excuses for her, convincing myself that if I just held on long enough, she would find her way back to me. But the truth was so much simpler and so much crueler. She wasn't lost. She had already moved on. The thought of confronting her felt exhausting, as if I had already fought a battle I hadn't realized I was waging, only to look around and see that I was the only one left standing. I didn't want to argue. I didn't want some drawn-out dramatic fight where she would twist things around, make me feel like I was overreacting, like I was the one at fault for noticing the way she had stopped loving me. I just wanted the truth, as painful as it might be. So one evening, after another day spent in the suffocating silence that had become our new normal, I finally asked her, flat out, without room for evasion or misdirection, if she still wanted to be with me. And for a long, agonizing moment, she said nothing at all. She just stared at me, her expression unreadable, and in that silence, in the absence of even the smallest reassurance, I had my answer. There were no tears, no apologies, no desperate attempts to convince me otherwise. She didn't even try to deny it. Instead, she let out a slow, measured breath, as if she had been waiting for this moment, waiting for me to finally catch up to where she had been all along. And then, with a shrug that felt like a knife twisting in my chest, she admitted it. She had been unhappy for a long time. She had been feeling disconnected. She wasn't sure if she loved me the way she used to. I had always imagined that if this moment ever came, if she ever said those words out loud, I would feel anger, betrayal, some burning need to fight for what we had built. But all I felt was relief, like an invisible weight I hadn't even realized I had been carrying had finally been lifted off my shoulders. Because now, finally, there were no more excuses, no more illusions, no more waiting for something that was never going to come back. And so for the first time in months, I stopped trying. I told her that if she didn't want to be with me, she didn't have to be. That I wasn't going to beg her to stay, wasn't going to keep grasping at something that had already slipped through my fingers. And just like that, it was over. Not in some explosive, cinematic way, but in the quiet, inevitable collapse of something that had been crumbling for far longer than either of us had been willing to admit. I slept on the couch that night, though I hardly slept at all. Instead, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of her moving around in the bedroom, no doubt already making plans for what came next, now that she no longer had to pretend. By morning, she had packed a bag and left, offering nothing more than a half-hearted promise that she would come back for the rest of her things later. And just like that, she was gone. I sat in the empty silence of the house, letting it all sink in, waiting for the grief to hit me in full force. But instead, all I felt was exhaustion. Not heartbreak, not devastation, just a bone-deep, soul-weary exhaustion that made it hard to do anything other than sit there and breathe. Because the truth was, I had already mourned this relationship. I had been grieving it for months, long before I ever had the courage to let it go. And now, for the first time in a long time, I didn't have to grieve anymore. First update, there's a strange kind of stillness that settles in after something you thought would last forever finally comes to an end. It's not immediate. Not like flipping a switch and suddenly feeling free. No. It creeps in slowly, in the quiet moments when you're standing in the kitchen making coffee for one instead of two, or when you wake up in the middle of the night and instinctively reach for someone who isn't there anymore. It's in the way the house feels bigger somehow, emptier, even though nothing has physically changed except for the absence of one person's presence. The first few days without Brittany were surreal. I had spent so long feeling like I was losing her, watching her drift further and further away, that by the time she was actually gone, it felt less like a shock and more like the inevitable conclusion to a story I had been trying to rewrite for too long. There were no teary breakdowns, no dramatic waves of emotion crashing over me. Instead, there was just an overwhelming sense of exhaustion, a weariness that had settled into my bones, making it hard to process whether I was relieved or just numb. At first, I kept expecting her to walk through the door, to hear the sound of her keys jingling as she tossed them onto the counter, to catch the scent of her perfume lingering in the hallway. But the days stretched on, and the silence remained unbroken. She didn't call, she didn't text, and I didn't reach out either because for the first time in a long time, I had nothing left to say. The strangest part wasn't that she was gone. It was realizing how little her absence actually changed anything. I had already been living alone in that house for months, sharing a space with someone who had checked out long before she ever packed her bags. The only difference now was that I no longer had to pretend. I no longer had to brace myself for the cold indifference in her voice. No longer had to navigate the tension that had become a permanent fixture between us. I had spent so much time fighting for something that was already broken beyond repair, convincing myself that if I just held on a little longer, if I just tried a little harder, I could fix what was slipping away. But now that it was over, now that there was nothing left to fight for, I could finally see how pointless it had all been. She had made her choice long before I had the courage to make mine. For the first time in months, maybe even years, I could breathe without feeling like I was suffocating under the weight of someone else's indifference. But as the days turned into weeks, something unexpected happened. At first, it was subtle, something I barely noticed, like the way I started sleeping better, no longer waking up to the sound of my own restless thoughts chasing me in circles, or the way I stopped dreading coming home, no longer bracing myself for the tension that had once hung in the air like an unspoken argument waiting to happen. Then, there were the small freedoms I hadn't even realized I had lost. Choosing what to watch without worrying whether she'd roll her eyes, cooking meals I actually wanted instead of catering to her ever-changing whims, playing music in the mornings without the fear of disrupting whatever mood she had decided to wake up in. And slowly, piece by piece, I started feeling like myself again. One evening, I found myself sitting on the porch with a beer in hand, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. It was one of those moments I would have once shared with Brittany, back in the days when things were easy, before love had turned into something I had to chase. And yet, as I sat there, feeling the cool evening air against my skin, I realized something that should have been obvious all along. I didn't miss her. Not really. I missed the idea of what we had been, the version of us that had existed in the beginning, before everything fell apart. But the Brittany I had been holding on to, the one I had been trying so desperately to keep, wasn't real anymore. Maybe she never had been. And that was the moment I knew. I was finally free. Not just from her, but from the weight of everything I had carried for so long. I had spent months feeling like I was drowning, like I was clawing at something just out of reach, desperate to hold on to a love that had already slipped through my fingers. But now, sitting in the quiet of my own space, with nothing but the hum of crickets and the distant sound of a car passing by, I finally understood what I had been too afraid to admit. I had been so focused on what I was losing that I never stopped to consider what I was gaining. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't felt in ages. Hope. The thing about moving on is that it doesn't happen all at once. It's not a single moment, a clean break where you wake up one morning and suddenly feel whole again. No, it's a slow process, a series of tiny shifts that you don't even notice until one day you catch yourself laughing at something without the weight of the past pressing down on you, or you realize that you went an entire afternoon without thinking about what was lost. Healing doesn't announce itself. It just arrives quietly, slipping into the empty spaces that grief once filled. At first, I had expected to feel a sense of devastation, the kind of aching loneliness that comes when a chapter of your life ends abruptly. But instead, what settled in was a strange sense of calm, as if my body had finally caught up to what my heart had already known for a long time. There were no sleepless nights spent questioning what I could have done differently, no desperate urge to reach out and fix something that had been beyond repair. The love I had fought so hard to hold on to had been gone long before she packed her bags, and now, with nothing left to fight for, all that remained was an empty kind of peace. I started filling my days with things I had forgotten I loved, rediscovering parts of myself that had been pushed to the side in the effort to keep Brittany happy. I went for long drives with no destination in mind, letting the road stretch out before me, the hum of the engine and the wind through the open window replacing the silence that had once felt suffocating. I reconnected with old friends, the kind I had unintentionally drifted away from because I had been so consumed by trying to fix something that had never been mine to fix in the first place. I found comfort in the small routines that had once felt mundane: morning coffee on the porch, the simple pleasure of reading without distractions, the quiet solitude of coming home to a space that finally felt like my own again. And yet, despite the growing sense of clarity, there were still moments when the past would creep in, uninvited and unwelcome. Sometimes it happened in the grocery store when I'd instinctively reach for something I used to buy for her before remembering she wasn't there to want it. Other times it was triggered by a familiar song playing on the radio, a melody that transported me back to late-night drives when things had been good, when I had still believed in the illusion of us. But even those moments, as sharp as they were, passed quicker than I expected, fading like echoes instead of wounds that refused to heal. I didn't hear from Brittany after she left, and I didn't reach out either. It wasn't that I harbored any lingering anger. I'd spent enough time carrying the weight of disappointment, and I had no desire to let it take up any more space in my life. But there was nothing left to say, nothing that would change what had already been done. The version of us that had once existed had long since dissolved, and there was no sense in trying to resurrect something that had already been laid to rest. Then, one evening, a message arrived. A simple, unassuming text that flashed across my screen like a ghost from another life. "Hey, how have you been?" It was from her. For a long moment, I just stared at the words, waiting for some kind of reaction to hit me. Anger, sadness, regret, something. But all I felt was an odd sort of detachment, as if I were reading a message meant for someone else entirely. I thought about ignoring it, about leaving it unanswered, and letting it drift away like everything else we had once shared. But instead, I typed out a response that was both honest and final. "I'm doing good. Hope you are too." And that was it. No resentment, no curiosity, no need to prolong a conversation that had no reason to continue. Whatever she had been searching for and reaching out, I wasn't interested in giving her. I had spent enough time waiting for her to see me, waiting for her to choose me, and now, standing on the other side of it all, I realized that I no longer needed her to. I had chosen myself. That night, for the first time in what felt like forever, I fell asleep with a lightness in my chest, a feeling of quiet certainty that I had made it through the storm, and I knew, without a doubt, that I wasn't looking back. Second update. The thing about closure is that it doesn't come in a grand, cinematic moment, not in the way people like to imagine. There is no final confrontation, no dramatic realization that suddenly sets everything right. It doesn't arrive with fireworks or neatly tied up endings. Instead, it sneaks up on you in the quietest moments. When you wake up one morning and realize you no longer feel the urge to check your phone for messages that never came, or when you catch yourself going an entire day without thinking about the person who once occupied so much space in your mind. For a long time, I thought moving on would feel like some monumental shift, a single turning point where everything suddenly made sense, where all the pain and confusion evaporated, leaving only clarity in its place. But what I learned in the months that followed Brittany's departure was that healing isn't a destination you arrive at. It's a series of small, almost imperceptible steps, a gradual shedding of the weight you never realized you had been carrying. At first, I wasn't sure what to do with the freedom her absence had left behind. I'd spent so much time wrapped up in the exhausting cycle of trying to hold on to something that had already unraveled. So much energy poured into a relationship that had turned into a one-sided battle, that when it was finally over, I felt strangely unmoored, like a ship that had spent years fighting against the current only to find itself drifting in open waters with no clear direction. But then, slowly, I started filling that space with things that mattered, things that made me feel alive again, things that reminded me of who I was before I had become someone who measured his worth by another person's affection. I went back to the gym, not to distract myself or to prove anything, but because I remembered how much I enjoyed the feeling of pushing myself, the satisfaction of steady progress, of reclaiming a sense of strength I had almost forgotten I had. I started spending more time outside, going on long walks with no destination in mind, letting the world around me settle into my bones, breathing in the crisp air without the weight of expectation pressing against my chest. I reconnected with old friends, the ones I had neglected, not out of malice, but because I had been too consumed by the slow deterioration of my relationship to be present for anything else. At first, there was hesitation, the lingering guilt of having let those bonds fade. But what I found was warmth, understanding, an easy familiarity that made me realize true friendships don't erode just because you lost yourself for a while. And somewhere along the way, without even noticing when it happened, I stopped feeling the need to analyze every detail of what had gone wrong. The late nights spent dissecting every conversation, every shift in Brittany's behavior, searching for some hidden clue I had missed. It all faded into something distant, something that no longer had power over me. I no longer cared about the why of it all, because the truth was, it didn't matter anymore. There was no single moment where everything had crumbled. There was no grand betrayal or sudden shift. It had been a slow unraveling, a gradual erosion of something that was never meant to last. And once I accepted that, truly accepted it, I realized there was nothing left to grieve. She had been a chapter in my life, but that chapter had ended, and I was okay with that. Then one evening, something happened that confirmed just how much I had truly let go. I was out with some friends, sitting at a bar that I had been to a handful of times before, but never really paid much attention to. The atmosphere was warm, filled with the low hum of conversation and the occasional burst of laughter from a nearby table. It was the kind of place I would have once wanted to bring Brittany to, back when I was still trying to hold on to the idea of us. But now, it was just a place, nothing more. And that's when I saw her. She was standing near the entrance, talking to someone I didn't recognize. Her head tilted slightly, in that way she always did when she was engaged in conversation. She looked the same, or maybe slightly different in a way that only someone who had once loved her would notice. Her hair was a little shorter, her posture a little looser, as if she too had shed something in the time since we had last spoken. For a brief moment, our eyes met across the room, and I felt nothing. No rush of emotion, no sudden pang of regret or nostalgia. Just a quiet acknowledgement that we had once been something to each other, and now we weren't. She gave me a small, almost hesitant smile, and I returned it, a simple nod, a silent understanding that whatever had once existed between us was well and truly over. And then, just as quickly as it happened, the moment passed. I turned back to my friends, laughing at a joke someone had just told, and without even meaning to, I moved forward. That was the moment I knew, really truly knew, that I was free. Not just from her, but from the weight of everything she had once represented. And for the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like something to fear. It felt like something I was ready to embrace.